We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma, atque semper Virgo, Felix te porta.
Everybody, Steve with Fidelity. I'm coming at you with somebody you may or may not have known before, Dr. Thomas Woods, author of quite a few books. I have this on the show right here. I have them all. I'm a big fan of all of them, really. And actually, well, take that back. I don't remember getting Church Confronts Modernity, but I will get that soon. And he's also interviewed a zombie. So I don't know too many people who have done that, along with 2,200 podcasts. Check it out on the website. We'll have it underneath in the show notes. But we want to talk about something that definitely is not on, as he quotes the 3x5 card of allowable opinion, national divorce, secession, breaking up. Dr. Woods, why is that not a popular thing? First off, welcome, and thank you for coming on to the program.
Well, my pleasure. Well, here's the thing. There is built into the way, unfortunately, most people think, a very strong status quo bias, that the way things are is the way they have to be. The way things are is the best way things could ever be. So back in my days as a professor, for example, if I would ask, now I'll grant you this is partly because the students just playing it safe, but if I would ever ask students, was the American Revolution inevitable? Answer is always yes. Every single one of them, always yes. Was the French Revolution inevitable? Answer is always yes. Everything is always exactly the way it had to be. And so if you look at the United States, the union of states that we have, is not an object of religious reverence. It's not supposed to be. It's a practical arrangement. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, we revisit it, we try something different. But that's not the attitude most people have. People have this status quo bias. This is the way that things are at this moment, is the exact way that they must be, they have to be. I was just talking to somebody the other day who's in charge of recruiting people for a movement called the Greater Idaho Movement. And the idea there is that there is a portion of Eastern Oregon, in fact, a great deal of it, that just has nothing in common with the rest of the state whatsoever, culturally, politically, philosophically, nothing at all. And they're constantly put upon by the rest of the crazy state. And what they want to do is withdraw from that state and become part of Idaho, where they would be part of a political arrangement that is more to their liking. And this would be to the benefit of everyone involved, because this would mean that the remainder of Oregon would be more likely to get what it wants without Eastern Oregon getting in its way. But Eastern Oregon could now get what it wants because it would be with more philosophically compatible people in Idaho. So this would basically benefit, virtually everybody, or at the very least, we can say that far more people would get what they want under that arrangement than under the current one. The only thing standing in the way of this is status quo bias, that, well, we can't. This line, this magic line between Idaho and Oregon is sacred and handed down to us from heaven, and we can't move it. Says who? In any other aspect of life, if something was not working and was resulting in frustration and agony and sorrow and just never everybody fighting with each other all the time, we would fix it. But this is the one area where you can't, because we've got this weird mysticism about the United States that the little lines within it can't be moved, and it has an exact heaven granted number of square feet that make it up, and this is all crazy superstition. This is crazy. This is idolatry. I don't know what else to say. We have to think of it as a practical arrangement that either works or it doesn't, and we adjust accordingly.
Because at the beginning of this union, there was secession movements even from the north. It's not just a southern thing, right?
Oh, by no means. The first people really to seriously talk about secession are talking about it in the first decade of the 19th century. And those are New Englanders. There was secession talk over the Louisiana Purchase. There was secession talk, mild secession talk over the embargo that Jefferson imposed, which greatly damaged the maritime economy of New England. And there was at least implied secession talk at the Hartford Convention of 1814 as the War of 1812 was winding down, because by that point, if you look at who had been president by that point, it had been, with the exception of John Adams, it had been one Virginian after another. And New England thought, well, how are our interests ever going to be protected in a union like this? So, and we can, and even when outright secession wasn't being called for, then nullification of federal actions was being called for. So we should nullify the embargo. We should nullify any possibility of a military conscription for the War of 1812. That was Daniel Webster's view. Again, over and over, and coming, as you say, coming from the North rather than the South. So this is all very deeply and profoundly American, to understand that the United States, again, is a practical arrangement, and to remember that every time the United States is referred to in the Constitution, it's always referred to in the plural, that the United States is a collection of societies. It's not one giant blob. It's a collection of societies that each have a life of its own. And so, therefore, in the same way that each of these societies acceded to the Union, then by exactly the same sovereign power by which they acceded to the Union, they can likewise secede from the Union. And this word secede and secession, these words have been so demonized in the American vocabulary and the American psyche. They've been so demonized that we can't have a rational discussion about them. That people just go berserk when they hear these words. But there's nothing. What's so scary about secession? It simply means that this arrangement isn't working. We have two incompatible political cultures, and it would be best for everybody for us to go our separate ways. I mean, that's common sense. There's nothing scary about that.
I love how New Hampshire, their secession movement, they start out with like 90 pros about why they leave. Number one is you'll get a pay raise by the income tax being gone. And I've told that the guys here, their eyebrows kind of go, "Wait, you're right. I keep 40% of my check that gets stolen all the time." That should be a great sales pitch. But the only divorce signs I see is divorce from your wife or divorce from your spouse. We're okay with that divorce, but we're okay being this dysfunctional, tyrannical union till death do his part, basically.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I bought the domain nationaldivorce.com, and nationaldivorce.com cost me a little bit. That was not your usual $10 domain, but that's where I have a free ebook on this. It's called National Divorce: the Peaceful Solution to Irreconcilable Differences. But you can also get it, if you're in the United States, you can also get it by texting the word national to the number 66866. So you go to 66866 and you text the word national, you automatically get the book. Well, I chose the word national. I could also have chosen divorce, but I was just imagining a spouse looking over the shoulder of the other spouse, texting divorce to a number, they'd get the wrong idea. So I chose the word national to text.
Yeah, in that book, that's why I'm asking. I asked Dr. Woods to come on this program, because he brings up, and it's mostly from the podcast that he's done. Go to the website to check it out for more. But you bring up coming back from the French Revolution, and Professor Livingston's brought up Johannes
Althusius, yeah.
And I've said this to priests, because I'm going, if we can get this in the Catholic view of, we can get the collars to know this stuff, maybe they could preach to the flock, and maybe voting would be a little bit different too. So who was this guy that nobody, it's Hobbes and a guy that no one knows of.
Yeah, right. So, and as you can see, when you read about him, you say, this sounds, even though he was a Protestant, you say what he's saying sounds vastly more compatible with Catholicism and Catholicism's outlook on society than anything that, that creep Thomas Hobbes thought up. Well, what I do in chapter 1 of the book is to say there are basically two ways we can look at this question. And they're represented by, on the one hand, Thomas Hobbes, who's somebody some of us read in college, 16th century English thinker. But also the other person is the one you've never heard of, which is kind of how you know he must be good. If they're not going out of their way to let you know about him, he's probably the good one. And Johannes Althusius was a theorist of the Dutch Federation. And he thinks of society in the following way. Thomas Hobbes thinks of society as being composed of just an aggregate of individual people with no social identities, just an aggregate of individuals. That's not the way Hobbes looks at it. I beg your pardon, that's not the way Althusius looks at it. Althusius thinks that people are actually formed by their social identities, and that society does not begin with the individual. It begins with the household. And in the household, we have the relations of authority and subordination. And that is the primordial unit of society. Then we have a group of societies can get together and form a village. And then a group of villages can get together and form a province. And each one of these things, each one of these provinces, villages, households, has an independent existence of its own. It's not just a flat aggregate blob of people, but a collection of little societies. And when we think about now we can apply to this the Catholic idea of subsidiarity. When we think about which level of society ought to be in charge of which responsibility, well, we first start with the household, and we assign to the household all those things, or we leave with the household all those things that the household is competent to manage. Some things will be beyond the competence of the household, so then we go to the village. And then when the village can't handle it, we go to the province. We don't immediately say we have a central government ruling over a bunch of individuals and it should be in charge of everything. That's not the way a healthy society operates. Now, when we then apply this to the United States, we see that the Althusian way of looking at things is precisely what I've been describing. I've been describing a United States that is what? A collection of societies, not an indivisible blob, but a collection of societies. And so it follows naturally from the Althusian model that if one particular unit is unhappy with the way it's being governed by something higher, it can withdraw from it because it has its own previously existing liberties and previously existing rights, because it came before any central government. The states were there before the federal government was, and the villages were there before the province was, in the Althusian way of thinking. And so these bodies have their own rights. In fact, when we look back in the Middle Ages, sometimes we find that some of the kings in the Middle Ages seem to us today to have had preposterously long titles. King of the so-and-so, protector of the such and such. And the reason the king had those titles had nothing to do with how vain he was, but rather it was a recognition of the pre-existing fact that he governs people and areas that have pre-existing liberties and rights that he can't just invade or cancel or arbitrarily overturn. So it's exactly the opposite of the situation we have today, where a U.S. federal government or a president can just arbitrarily make demands of communities all over the country, and a centralized Supreme Court can impose all kinds of social revolutions on every single neighborhood in the entire country, and not one of them is allowed to resist, because the thinking is every neighborhood and every state is the creation of the federal government, has no pre-existing liberties of its own, and can be tampered with anytime we want another social revolution carried out. Obviously, we see how that's been working. So to my mind, the Althusian model is far, far healthier for a society. And that would include the right for some of these smaller bodies to go their own way and find their own destiny.
As you mentioned, all the problems you see going on, I mean, it's not a magic wand thing. All right, we break up and everything's, there's
Right.
stuff that goes on. And like I think you brought up in a podcast, just like a divorce, you have to negotiate some items. But when I hear people complain about, the FBI has arrested pro-lifers, or this guy's doing this, or Biden's doing this, and I go, divorce from DC and you eliminate Brandon, you eliminate Pelosi, depending on where you live, obviously, there's a lot of pros that go in this. I guess maybe it's the US Olympics that people want to stay in the Union for. I mean, the founders weren't this way, right?
No, that's certainly true. I mean, Jefferson's view was that it was probably likely that the United States would settle into 2, possibly 3 confederations. Um, so it's interesting that some people, when they think about what the United States is, they think, well, it's this union of states. It's a great big country. Yes, a union of states is what it is supposed to be, but a union of states, not a United State in the singular. And as I say, the fact that in the period of the early republic, there is so much discussion of the possibility of nullifying what the federal government is doing or outright secession. This was part of the national vocabulary. Goes to show that this was not some wild, crazy philosophy. But going back to the earliest days of the republic, we see legal theorists talking about this, and they're not that well known because it's not the narrative that the textbook authors want today. They want the United States as a single, irresistible, indivisible blob with a central government at the center that can dictate orders to everybody in every nook and cranny of it. Well, obviously, the textbook authors like that model, so that's the one they're going to present to you. But people like St. George Tucker, again, nobody's heard of St. George Tucker. He was one of the great legal theorists of the 1790s. Abel Upshur, nobody's ever heard of him, although he did serve in the federal government. I mean, he also served as a federal judge. And Thomas Jefferson himself. Against that, we have Daniel Webster, who in the 1830s tried to come up with a theory whereby the United States was just a single, indivisible blob. But it wasn't until like the 1820s or 30s that anybody even theorized about that. Until then, the only theory of the United States was what we call the compact theory, that the United States is a collection of sovereign states. That was the only theory until there was this effort to come up with some other one to excuse a federal government that wanted to do what it wants.
And why have state constitutions if that's the right? I mean, you hear the
Right,
Second
there's no
Amendment.
point in having a state constitution if the federal government does everything.
Yeah, exactly. That's what drives me batty when you see the Second Amendment, Second Amendment, Second Amendment. I go, what's in your state constitution? I had a guy in Denver, Colorado, running for the state house, state constitution, state government, not worried about the federal. And he was quoting from the federal constitution. I asked something about the state constitution. He had no clue. And I've been there
No
2
idea.
weeks.
Do we have a constitution? Yeah. That's what happens when you neglect your local institutions, right? It gets embarrassing. You don't even know you don't even know there's a constitution you need to be referring to in your state.
But one nation under God, isn't that the mantra of the Union?
How about a whole bunch of nations under God, right? And that's not anything that comes out of the founding fathers. I mean, if you look at if we want to talk about the Pledge of Allegiance, I mean that's written by a socialist who, of course, like all socialists, is completely against the idea. Like all totalitarians are against the idea of a collection of states in a federation because they want power. That's how you carry out socialism, is with power. And you can't have a state resisting you. You can't have states with existences of their own. And I hate, to bring up Hitler because everybody's bringing up Hitler for everything. but Hitler made clear that if there's one thing he wanted to do, it was to try his best to block German federalism, because he can't have a bunch of states making their own decisions. He embodies the will of the people in his own will, which is the way every dictator thinks, that I embody the will of the people. So I shouldn't have to deal with all these obstacles, which is, by the way Teddy Roosevelt thought. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is loved by everyone, which is how you can tell he must have been a bad president. If Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton love him, and also Mitt Romney loves him, then he's no good. Okay, I don't have time to go into. I've written about Teddy Roosevelt, but he's no good from that alone. But his view was, I embody the will of the people. That everybody else in the Senate, well, each senator was elected by his state, but I was elected by the whole people. So I shouldn't have to deal with obstructionists in the Senate. I'm trying to carry out the will of the people. So there was a time when the US was working out an arrangement with the Dominican Republic, and the Senate would not pass this treaty or would not ratify this treaty. And so when the Senate went out of session, Teddy Roosevelt just renamed it, not a treaty, but an executive agreement, and then just ratified it himself. And he said, well, of course I can do that because I embody the will of the people. All of this stuff is dangerous, dangerous talk because it gives one particular person carte blanche, in effect, to do what he wants in the name of representing the will of the whole people. We don't want any of that. That's not anything. That's not part of the U.S. The Union of States that constitutes the United States.
And wasn't that what Mason, I mean, the part of the Anti-Federalist, the real Federalist, he warned about the elected king, elected monarch, in a sense.
That's right. There are some, not all, but some warnings from the so-called Anti-Federalists. And you're right. Isn't it ridiculous how upside down these terms are? I mean, they're the ones who wanted real federalism, and they're the Anti-Federalists. But they did indeed warn about this, and they did indeed warn about a central government that would do whatever it wanted. And and people like Alexander Hamilton were trying to assure people in the Federalist, which is sometimes called the Federalist Papers, but in the original it was just the Federalist. And Alexander Hamilton would say, oh, look, the federal government is going to have only those powers that are delegated to it in the Constitution. And he gave agriculture as an example. There's no authority over agriculture, so that would rest with the states. But then once the Constitution is ratified, all of a sudden, Alexander Hamilton interprets the Constitution all differently. Oh, no, agriculture can come under federal supervision. Oh, really? So once the people have gone ahead and ratified it and it takes effect, and they're not quite trapped, but it is a bit of an ordeal to get out of it, as you can see. Then all of a sudden he's going to let them know, oh, by the way, there are all these powers we can exercise over you. What?
Yeah, it's so guys, this is one of those things that's not a perfect one. Like I said, you don't swipe the wand and it just happens. It's something that needs to be talked about. I personally believe it's the only political option available on the table because, as I think as you wrote in your book, the free ebook, Hobbes is the vote harder mentality. And that's all you see is, hey, we'll just wait for November. I have people talking about in 2 years, we'll get the vote for Trump again. That's between then and now. We don't care about what happens. We just need Trump back in the office and everything's going to be sunshine and lollipops again.
Yeah, we've definitely got to think differently, especially because we're now in an environment in which at least the left is obviously just going to use its power to strike out at people like you and me. The left is going to do that. The right is generally not going to do that because that's just not what they're made of. So in that kind of arrangement, who do you think is going to win out?
Yeah.
But indeed, we have to think differently, even though, yes, there will be problems. And yes, mere secession doesn't solve all problems because a lot of times there's also conflict within a state. Yes, that's true. But before you list for me all the reasons that a national divorce or American secession is inadequate or won't work, also make me a list of all the problems we suffer under now. Because it's not fair to cast my proposed solution against a perfect alternative, but the existing status quo doesn't get critiqued at all. No. I cast my solution against the actual system we have now, not some perfect system, but the actual system we have now. They both have drawbacks.
Yeah.
I just think this alternative has fewer of them.
As Professor Livingston told me, is that we got to break up, but then we got to convert it. So it's that act locally, think locally that your friend Brian McClanahan talks about all the time. It's a mantra I can't stop getting out of my head.
That's right.
Dr. Woods, I appreciate your time. I'll put the links in the show notes for the nationaldivorce.com, the Tom Woods Show. He's got, like I said, 2,200 podcasts up. Check out the books. And you got the Liberty Classroom, the homeschooling network.
Yeah, homeschooling is ronpaulhomeschool.com.
So appreciate, Dr. Woods, your time, and thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.